Back in 1983, a company would be created in Japan that was founded by a guy named Masashi Miyamoto. This company would become known as Square. Square was originally a computer gaming software division for a power line construction company called Denyusha that was owned by his father, Masafumi Miyamoto. While the time of game development was being handled by one programmer, Masashi Miyamoto thought about hiring graphic designers, programmers, and professional story writers to expand development by having more people collaborate on common projects. One of these designers was a part-time employee by the name of Hironobu Sakaguchi, and he designed 2 games for the NEC PC-8801, an early Z-Log computer system that was based exclusively in Japan like the MSX and the MSX2. These 2 titles were known as The Death Trap and a sequel, Will, The Death Trap 2. Both games became a major success, with the first game selling 500,000 copies and the sequel selling 100,000 copies in Japan. As to seeing that no future was inbound for something like the NEC PC-8801, Square's focus on game design started to shift toward the Nintendo Famicom, with the company porting GameArt's own Thexter from the NEC PC-8001 version to the Famicom in September 1985. 1 year later, in September 1986, Square spun off from Denyusha and became an independent company that would be known as Square Company Limited. The coming of Square Company would mean that video game development became an official start for the developer. Hironobu Sakaguchi transferred himself from a part-time employee to a full-time employee to spend more time with game development. The next up-and-coming individual that joined Square's ranks would be a young but very skilled musician by the name of Nobuo Uematsu. His first project he worked on music for was the game Genesis, and Sakaguchi took notice of Uematsu's work, and they formed a great friendship from that point on, as they both agreed to work together on the same projects. Many of these games that they would work on would be King's Knight, a scrolling shooter with a medieval setting, 3D World Runner, a third-person rail shooting platformer, Rad Racer, a racing game, Nakayama Miho no Tokimeki High School, a dating sim game, and JJ, another scrolling shooter. Each game released with scores and sales declining with every new release. Rad Racer may have gained a cult following from around the world, but that still didn't make up for the unsuccessful hits that it would only start to force the up-and-coming studio into a period of decline, as Square was threatened with bankruptcy. However, Sakaguchi was not willing to give up if he had one more chance to redeem himself in the company, and he had a master plan to back it up. It was either put in the full emphasis to make a game to go beyond expectations for a Famicom title, or it would mean that he would go back to work at the university he graduated from. That plan was to make the next game act as if it was Square's final game, and one that would have its core being that of the term, fantasy. RPG started to become a very prominent thing in the Western world, with Dungeons & Dragons being a prime example of that phenomenon. Wizardry, proving grounds of the Mad Overlord, became the pinnacle of video game RPGs when it was originally released for the Apple II computers in September 1981, and Hironobu Sakaguchi was inspired to make a game based around the innovative command-based system that Wizardry created. However, an RPG series has started out around the time when Square's supposed last game was in development, and that RPG was revealed as Dragon Quest for the Famicom that was developed by Enix, with key members being its creator named Yuji Horii, the composer Koichi Sugiyama, and character designs by the famous manga artist named Akira Toriyama, who created the Shonen Jump craze known as Dragon Ball. Sakaguchi was at the helm of designing and writing the game, and he had Nobuo Uematsu at the helm to compose the music. What Sakaguchi needed was a person to do character designs to make his character stand out, as Toriyama did with Dragon Quest. He was in luck, as a new employee by the name of Yoshitaka Amano joined Square Company, and he was immediately hired to be the character designer and title logo illustrator after his successful work at Tatsunoko Productions, with big hits such as Speed Racer, Gatchaman, where it was known as G-Force in the West, Tekkaman, and Honeybee Hutch. With the main force behind the game, it was time for Sakaguchi's ultimate creation to begin. The development team behind this project was declared as the A-Team to be inspired by the heroes from the TV show to pull through if they were to make a video game. Though often to the company allegedly being threatened with bankruptcy, Sakaguchi was ready to put his life in game development on the line to determine whether he has the creativity and will to keep moving forward or to retire from game development altogether. His concept for this game was to have a large overworld map to explore and to have an engaging story like Dragon Quest. Instead of having only one solo hero, this game would pit gamers in a band of 4 warriors who are burdened in saving their own world from eternal darkness, as it is about to be succumbed to a terrible fate. This project would be revealed to the public under the name Final Fantasy. It would be worked on by the efforts of Yoshitaka Amano working on the character designs and title logo illustration, Hironobu Sakaguchi as the head designer along with Hiromichi Tanaka, Akitoshi Kawazu, and Koichi Ishii, and with Sakaguchi being the base story planner, Nobuo Uematsu as the game's composer, Kenji Terada as the scenario writer of the game's plot based on what Sakaguchi had in mind, and an Iranian-American named Nasir Gabelli worked as the game's head programmer, along with Kiyoshi Yoshi and Ken Narita, and Kazuya Shibuya who worked on the game's graphic design. It was quite a small development team, but that was how games usually were consistent of back in the days of the NES, as they weren't that big as with game developers as of today. After a long development cycle that took almost a year to complete, Final Fantasy was released on the Nintendo Famicom in Japan on December 18, 1987, just 7 days before Christmas. Final Fantasy takes place in a fantasy world that consisted of 3 large continents. The elemental powers of the world are governed by the 4 crystals, and each of those crystals bear the elements of earth, fire, wind, and water. Numerous races are also a staple in the game, such as humans, dwarves, elves, mermaids, dragons, and even robots. It may seem odd for a game filled with fantasy to have robots in it, but this game started the knack of having steampunk elements in it, which would be a staple in later games. 400 years prior to the beginning of the game, a race of people known as the Lufanes used the power of wind to craft airships and build a giant space station called Floating Castle, but the Lufanes' own country went into decline when the wind crystal went dark. 200 years later, a very powerful and violent storm sank a massive shrine that served as the center of an ocean-based civilization as the water crystal also started to go dark. The Earth Crystal and Fire Crystal followed shortly after by plaguing the planet with raging wildfires and devastating an agricultural village known as Melmond as the plains and vegetation were destroyed. The planet was bound to suffer many eons of darkness based on the light fading away from the crystals, but the sage Lucan foretells a prophecy that 4 warriors of light will come and save the world from utter catastrophe. Final Fantasy is set up in that regard, as the story begins when 4 youthful and unnamed warriors appear out of nowhere, with each of them holding one of the darkened crystals in their hands. At the beginning, the Warriors of Light have initial access to the kingdom of Corneria, where the king asked their help to save his daughter, Princess Sarah, who was abducted by a knight named Garland. Garland was once a top general in Corneria's army, but has fallen from grace as he now plots to destroy the peaceful kingdom and obtain world domination. The Light Warriors track down the rogue knight and the princess to the north at Chaos Shrine, where they foil the criminal's plans and they supposedly kill him in the process. Princess Sarah is saved, and she is escorted back to the kingdom of Corneria, where the king rewards the warriors with access beyond the bridge just north of the kingdom. Upon crossing the bridge and gazing at the kingdom within the horizon, the main adventure begins. Throughout the journey, the Warriors of Light travel to numerous locations such as the town of Pravica to liberate it from pirates terrorizing the citizens to where they gain access to their own ship, a series of delivery quests such as retrieving a stolen crown from a marsh cave to a king from a ruined castle, fighting against a dark elf named Astos to gain the mystic key from the elves to unlock all sealed doors, delivering TNT to the dwarves to destroy an isthmus that connects the Aldi Sea to the outside world, and defeating the 4 Fiends of Elements to bring the 4 crystals to their full strength. The 4 Fiends of Elements are agents in protecting the crystals to prevent them from regaining their light, as they wish to prolong the darkness for all eternity. The 4 Fiends consist of the Earth Fiend Lich, the Fire Fiend Marilith, the Water Fiend Kraken, and the Wind Fiend Tiamat. Along the way, the warriors come across a trial from the Dragon King named Bahamut to obtain a rat's tail which promotes them to new attire that makes them stronger than their standard classes, and discovering the Lufanes to help get access to some of the hard-to-reach locations such as the Floating Castle. After fully destroying the 4 Fiends, the warriors manage to restore light to the crystals, and their power gives them the opportunity to travel 2,000 years into the past from the Temple of Fiends to find the marauder causing the darkness within the world. The culprit behind this atrocity is none other than Garland, who the warriors thought that they had defeated. However, Garland's body and spirit was warped into the past by the Four Fiends after his defeat at Chaos Shrine in the present, and he used this advantage to send the Four Fiends into the future to cause all the damage to the world as of now, and to where Garland would be stuck in an infinite wormhole to live forever. The long age has transformed the ungraceful rogue knight into an archdemon known as Chaos. The Warriors of Light faced Chaos in one final battle to save the world from further decline, and they succeeded in ending Chaos's ongoing paradox. The Warriors returned home, victorious, and their heroic deeds of changing the future have remained unknown outside of legend in due time. Final Fantasy's gameplay takes a page from Dragon Quest, but it takes things to a new level. As mentioned, this is the first JRPG to have multiple characters in a player's party, to where they can have their own jobs to benefit around the whole adventure. At the start of the game, the player must give names to the Warriors of Light, and each of them can have their own jobs to encompass the many possibilities of surviving throughout the whole journey. Final Fantasy only has 6 jobs for the players to choose for each character. The fighter character allows them to use brute-based weapons like swords and axes to do lethal damage, and to act more like a leader to the group. The thief is not only the fastest character, but one that deals lesser damage on foes during the heat of conflict. The white mage is the healer who can cure status ailments as well as hit point and magic point depletion. The black mage is a character who can cast spells like fire, ice, and thunder to do elemental damage on foes. The monk is the unarmed type who battles with their fists, and to meditate in trying to grow their strength or defense, and the red mage character is a jack-of-all-trades job where the position allows the character to utilize both black and white magic, as well as wielding swords, but the overall strength is inferior to the fighter, black mage, and white mage combined. 4 main modes come into play when traversing the journey, and those features are the exploration of the world map, the exploration of towns and dungeons, the menus to purchase and change equipment and stats, and both the random enemy and boss battles. The exploration of the world map allows the player to travel freely to wherever they choose, but they can walk around to encounter random enemies to fight. Exploring through towns meant that players can talk to people in order to gain useful information or to obtain hidden items within the community, while the dungeons act as a means to complete a certain task or to go from point A to point B while finding enemies and some bosses along the way. The menu system has many modes of this base, as one of them allows players to switch equipment, using items, and view stats of their characters, while there are shops in certain towns where they can purchase newer weapons, items, as well as magic spells. Finally, the battle mode acts as a means for players to command their characters to use their skills and abilities to win and survive each fight. 5 screens are on the main screen, where one of them has the enemies the characters are facing along with their names, the second shows the player's main party with their own names, and the third shows the commands as well as the battle statistics that are given to the player to view. Players can attack with the party's weapons and magic, use items when in desperation to heal the characters from danger, defend from enemy attacks, or they could try to make a full stand and endure a battle while ending up dying in the process. When a character is killed, they can be brought back to a town that has a church, where the priest can restore the soul of one of the fallen warriors to fight once more, but at the price of however many GP is in the player's currency. If players manage to win so many battles, their characters can gain experience points, and they can level up with an increase in their attributes, as well as potentially upgrading the character's job with newer skills and a newer sprite portrait. GP is another feature that acts as the main currency for within the game, where it is renamed as Gil in later games to fit with the series' main theme of money. Defeating enemies and uncovering treasure chests would allow players to find money or obtain newer items for characters' use by all means. The last thing to talk about for the main gameplay is the difficulty. Most people can agree that Final Fantasy is one of the most challenging games to ever grace a Nintendo console, and its challenge is on par with how Dragon Quest is. Players have a currency system for certain characters' magic skills, meaning that they can use a set of leveled magic skills a set number of times before running out of magic points, and it made using magic much more difficult. That feature is removed in later installments to make things a bit more streamlined. The battles mostly ended up as trial and error, as the player can suffer the loss of a comrade based on the trial and error of hit detection that their characters act from their own accuracy. Most of the items are overpriced, and the money the player obtains from enemies is very small, so that made the need for fighting mini battles almost a requirement, as well as a test of endurance. Backtracking is always a requirement in case anyone missed out on some items that are either helpful or extremely mandatory based on certain circumstances, like the TNT dynamite that the characters have to deliver to the dwarves to gain access out of the Aldi seat. Finally, some of the stuff that players have to obtain for their characters, like weapons and armor, are not described about who could use what, but this was probably based on the limitations of the Famicom, to where so many things could not fit onto a cartridge. In other words, this was more of a way for players to use a walkthrough, or to ask help from those who managed to complete it. Final Fantasy's gameplay remained as a core element for future installments that would be enough to satisfy anyone. Other than that, the other thing that made the game emotionally gripping was the game's soundtrack composed by Nobuo Uematsu. Uematsu's philosophy on how he composes music is more based on the themes that surround a particular game, and he can grasp what would sound best based on particular situations. For instance, the overworld map theme was meant to grip players into an adventurous feeling when traveling from place to place. The theme of Mount Gold gave gamers a sense of an upbeat feeling, as if traveling into a dangerous location like a volcano, which Mount Gold was based after. Matoya's cave was used to enrapture the surreal atmosphere of various caverns like the ice cave to reflect its pretty nature, or the waterfall cave to encapsulate the gamer into a more calming mood. However, there are 4 pieces of music that define the first game and its sequels, and they are the prelude theme that played at the opening title screen, the main prologue theme that embarked the player on a grand adventure, the battle theme to give an urgency for the player to win, and the victory theme that would give gamers satisfaction for completing a battle that was either easy or hard. Each of those themes were meant to give the player a reminder of what Final Fantasy truly is, based on their iconic tracks that still maintain a strong presence even now. In later games, those themes would mostly be remixed or arranged with newer instrumentations, or to sound very different in that particular version, but not all themes would make a return, as later entries tend to omit them from their full soundtracks. Final Fantasy's music maintains a true stature in its quality that cannot be matched with many other games at the time. After releasing on December 18, 1987 in Japan, Final Fantasy on the Famicom became very well received by both critics and gamers, and it has become Square's first commercial hit to sell over 400,000 copies at the time. The game was recognized as being one of the first JRPGs, along with Dragon Quest, to innovate and revolutionize the genre, where it would be enough to influence many developers to create many newer franchises that were to follow in the coming years. Even those who played role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons and books have even claimed that playing a game like this was as close as it could get to the standard book RPGs that exist. Final Fantasy was successful for both the ratings and the sales, as it would be enough to consider the game to enter a period of a long-lasting franchise. When Nintendo of America caught glimpse of the strong sales and reviews of the game from overseas, and when they saw the positive reception and sales of Dragon Quest, which was called Dragon Warrior within their own territory, Nintendo gave a strong endorsement to Square to localize their game for the Western audience, so that they could get a slice of the pie in trying out this gem of a title. Square obliged to the idea, and Final Fantasy was localized for the North American market by over 2.5 years later. Reception of Final Fantasy in North America was very strong, and has created a fan following as much as the one from Japan. However, based on the upcoming release of the Super Famicom and Super Nintendo Entertainment System, this would be the only entry that North America would get instead of all the NES games in the series that were made in between the original Japanese version's release to the North American version's release, as the time to jump ship between consoles was about to hit full force. Final Fantasy would go on to receive numerous awards and accolades from many gaming magazines and video game websites to this day, as being one of the RPGs that started a strong trend to have a devoted following. Its legacy would be very strong, where various foundations, such as the music, would be used outside of the game. For example, in the show Captain N the Game Master, the basis of Final Fantasy would be used in the series finale. 8-Bit Theater, a famous webcomic, parodied the game in one of the early chapters, and it has become very popular even after starting in March 2001. The reception and legacy that the first Final Fantasy left within gaming is one that has become a worldwide phenomenon as time went by. Final Fantasy was met with strong reception, but with the strong reception came criticism as well. Some people feel that Final Fantasy's pacing within the story progression and battle system was very slow, and the amount of grinding for experience and farming for gil made the game feel very repetitive to doing the same thing over and over, with the game hardly moving forward. The graphics also got into the facade of criticism, as many claim to this day that Final Fantasy on the NES remains being visually outdated, as no effort went into delivering attention to detail when creating the mini environments, the portraits of bosses and boss fights, and the lack of color based on the limited palette that Square went by when developing this long game. Plus, the amount of backtracking became a mixed bag, as the delivery quest without initially exploring more of the world didn't feel that engaging when players didn't have a direct emphasis on where to go, and the lack of a world map to traverse through. By this day, most people claim this entry to be the most difficult in the series, and they feel that the game was only made to take a stab at imitating the Dragon Quest formula with nothing new. Despite the negativity it gets from modern critics, the game still became a huge success upon its release, with many still claiming that the game is a rewarding experience, and the inevitability of it becoming a franchise was just. Ever since Final Fantasy released throughout the many years of its existence, the game has been ported and remade several times on various platforms, and most of these re-releases were made to accommodate a system's control scheme, emphasizing remixed soundtracks, imploring better graphics, bonus material, and full-motion videos in more recent ports. Final Fantasy was re-released first on the Japanese MSX2 computers with minor graphical updates, more musical tracks and sound effects, as well as loading times. Next, the first and second game were re-released as one game for the Famicom in 1994, with a few graphical updates. In 2000, the game saw its third re-release on the WonderSwan Color by adding in backgrounds for the battle maps and redrawn sprites. An enhanced remake of the first two games were made on the PlayStation in a compilation called Final Fantasy Origins that came out in 2003, with enhanced graphics, music, first use of FMVs, more sophistication in the game, a new art gallery, and a memo save function. The next re-release for that game and the second was in 2004 for the Game Boy Advance called Final Fantasy 1 and 2 Dawn of Souls, where there are 4 new dungeons, an updated bestiary, and a few tweaks. Final Fantasy also made it to the PSP with high-resolution hand-drawn 2D sprites, another enhanced soundtrack, newer FMVs, a newer dungeon, as well as the ones and the script from Dawn of Souls. Right now, Final Fantasy's latest re-release is made available on the iPhone's iOS feature that is based on the PSP version, where the Windows Phone and Android versions are based on the iOS game, and the PSP version making it on the 3DS eShop in Japan as of recent. Final Fantasy has also made it to the Wii's Virtual Console for all regions from around the world for newcomers to try it out, older gamers to relive the memories of the first game, and for Europeans to try out the original for the first time, since it never saw a proper release in their region. Being released so many times on various platforms has labeled the first Final Fantasy as one of the most milked entries that has been re-released several times, but with fewer additions, updated scripts with various tweaks, and so on. Even those labeled Final Fantasy as being a JRPG that has not aged well based on the graphics, the pacing, and its influence, as it merely overshadows the rise of the genre that was started by Dragon Quest. None can disagree that Final Fantasy remains as one of the best video games ever created, that its influence would inspire the creation of later JRPGs such as Breath of Fire, the Tales series, the Mana series, Chrono Trigger, Star Ocean, and even the Suikoden franchise. Without Final Fantasy's influence, many would feel that JRPGs would probably have not been where they were if it wasn't for the first game's success, and Dragon Quest probably would have been the only one to innovate the genre. Sakaguchi knew that he created potential for Final Fantasy to be long-lived and to rival Dragon Quest, as it would mark the beginning of a strong rise for the company known as Square. Next time on RRPG's Final Fantasy Retrospective, we take a look at the sequel where its gameplay and story took a different approach, and the third game where it became a mixture of the first two games, but with major improvements.